Let's get into our Hall of Fame news, where Chauncey Billups was also here in Charlotte yesterday, and the guy was glowing, man. He was he walked into that little dinky photo room where there's probably like 11 seats and sat down in front of that Blazers backdrop and had just an absolute grin on his face. And when people first started asking him about it, he seemed truly, genuinely humbled and honored, which was kind of a cool moment for me personally, being that, as we've talked about this on the show, I'm so anti-awards culture, and why does the Hall of Fame even exist? Why do we need to tell these people who already made millions of dollars and have been enshrined in their local cultures that oh yeah, you're going to have your head in bronze in some random place outside of Boston that no one really goes to, and there's one restaurant across the street off the highway.
Why all this slander for Springfield, Massachusetts? It's done nothing to you.
I went there one time with my AAU team, and we did not play well in the tournament because we had too much fun at the Hall of Fame. So maybe that's what it is. Also, I remember that gym being I forget what high school it was, some high school in Springfield, Mass, and there was no air conditioning. That was the most I've ever sweat in my life until this summer when I did one hike in Vietnam and I couldn't open my phone because my hands were too perspired, whatever the word would be. But yeah, Chauncey Billups. I don't know. Our producer, John Gennaro, before we came on the show was kind of is he worthy of the Hall of Fame? I don't know where the line is, but the guy seemed genuinely pleased. Similar to Steve Clifford, he was my dream was only really to make the NBA. I never really thought anything more than that. So the fact that this has come is pretty cool. Vince Carter also named to the Hall of Fame as well. He has a much different resume, but I'm going to stop talking and let the ball go to my podcast partner here. Dan, any thoughts on this early Hall of Fame news?
Well, I mean, Chauncey Billups, much more of a pass-first point guard than my host on this program. We're pounding the rock here. No, Chauncey Billups is going to be a really interesting conversational case. Because the statistical resume is not overwhelming, right? The individual, how many points he scored, how many assists he generated, all that kind of stuff. I haven't done the Basketball Reference stat dive. I normally do that. I did it for Vince Carter. I didn't have time this morning on Chauncey, but he was the best player on a championship team. He was a finals MVP. He was the best player on Pistons teams that made 6 straight conference finals. He was a 5-time All-Star and a 3-time All-NBA selection. You could make a reasonable argument that he was maybe the second or third best point guard of that decade, of the 2000s, if you put Nash up ahead of him because he won from the MVPs. But in terms of the impact he had on winning teams and the postseason success of those teams in Detroit, and then also in Denver, they had that sort of second chapter to his all-star level career before, later in his career starts getting injured. But even then, he's playing reasonable roles on good teams in with the Clippers too. He was a player of consequence on teams that mattered for a long time, and even was a contributor past his prime. And so that I think it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that sort of stacks up. Although you never thought of Chauncey Billups as the best player in the league, or maybe an all NBA first team caliber player. You kind of can't tell the story of what that decade of basketball was without the teams he was a big part of. And then he also was he was the leader of a team that was within 1 win of a repeat, 2 straight championships. So that's interesting. And to your broader point of why do we have the Hall of Fame? I know you're being facetious and you're kind of, it's an extend.
I'm really not.
Well, okay. Well, if you're not, then the answer is because that is a museum to teach people about the history of the game.
Yes.
And to celebrate its greatest participants, but also this is what these are museums. That's what Halls of Fame are.
For sure.
And so that's what, Chauncey Billups, his role in that, reasonable people can disagree about it. And where he, stacks up against, he's not LeBron James or whatever, right? But does he deserve or merit inclusion in that? museum of like, this is how we tell the story of the game, there's a pretty reasonable argument for that. Vince Carter, I think that's maybe the stronger point in his favor than even the statistical resume, which he's one of 66 players in history to make 8 All-Star teams. All the rest of them are in the Hall of Fame, except for the ones that are currently playing or recently retired, rather. Dwight, Carmelo Anthony, and then also Larry Faust, who played in the 50s. I can't speak intelligently about Larry Faust's game, but
Larry Faust got robbed, man. He should be in there.
Well, listen, people forget he was a problem. He was a bucket. Vince is one of 15 players ever with more than 25,000 points, 6,000 rebounds, and 4,000 assists. 11 of them are already in. The other 3 are LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and Russell Westbrook, so they will be as well. Again, you get to that point of like, was Vince the best player in the league? I get, you could maybe make that argument at some point, in the early part of his career in Toronto. He never advanced further than, as the leader of the team. There was that one series, famously, he leaves against the Sixers to go graduate from UNC, comes back the day of Game 7. They lose that series. The Sixers wind up going on to the NBA Finals. Vince was never the leader of a team like that. The way he left out of Toronto was
my childhood, man. That was it right there.
Yeah, all these so there's a lot to pick through in the narrative strands of it. But I think, you mentioned Jordi Fernandez being the head coach of the Canadian national team that is like this golden generation of Canadian talent. It's not as simple as you draw a line from Vince Carter being a Raptor to this generation of players, but it's not that simple. Like, all of these guys get into the NBA and get into basketball and get into, competing at the highest level because of what Vince Carter did as like an elevator of like an ambassador for NBA basketball to Toronto. You can't tell the story of basketball in Canada without Vince Carter. And if the Canadian program is going to be, among the best in the world moving forward, that's huge. And you can't tell the story of the last, 20 odd years of the NBA without the best dunk contest performance of all time. So,
sure,
like, those things in a museum context, I think, you can't tell the story of the game without Vince Carter. And so I think that's the part where statistical resumes and was this guy actually the best? And would you put him on a level with Larry Bird? No. But if you have like sort of an expansionist view of what these storytelling devices are, I think there's probably room in the house for both those guys, even if it's maybe on a different floor.
Only guy to play in the NBA over 4 different decades. I think the coolest this is not why he's in the Hall of Fame, but I think the coolest thing about Vince is that he was able to do pretty much what every all-star scorer guy never did.
Yeah.
Is have this second run of being a complimentary piece. And some of my favorite stories I've ever written back at Sports Illustrated, when I talked to Dirk and Vince about what they physically had to do to play at 40 when they're dealing with the bad back and the weird elbow that you deal with every day. Those guys were playing in the fucking league.
Man, I'll tell you what, I think there's a lot of ways in which I'm very similar to Dirk Nowitzki and Vince Carter. Dead-eye accuracy, explosive vertical leaping. But really, that's it. Just knowing what it takes to play at the highest level as you get up into your 40s. I salute that. I always think about, shouts out to Steve McPherson, who now I don't know what Steve does professionally, but for a long time he did write about the NBA. Very good guy. He wrote, did like got Vince for a minute for the New York Times when they had the Off the Dribble blog there, and asked him about dunking as he gets older. And he's like, getting up isn't the problem. It's the landings that are a problem. The landings hurt. And as I always think about that, but you're absolutely right. Like we saw Carmelo Anthony struggle with it. We saw Russell Westbrook struggle with it. Like every superstar gets to the point where they have to accept that they are not the centerpiece of everything and they have to find a way to contribute. He did that more gracefully than maybe anybody who ever reached that level. So shouts out to him.